They weren't just eating, they were living everyday moments. 6 ordinary meals, each meant to be harmless but ended in tragedy. In the routine of food and comfort, one mistake was all it took. These are the final moments of people whose lives were cut short in the most bizarre ways. It was January 1st, 2015 in Tokyo, and the city was alive with New Year holiday celebrations. Families across the city gathered to eat traditional dishes that are part of the annual custom. Among these dishes is mochi, a sticky rice cake that is eaten during this season. It is soft but heavy and becomes glue-like when chewed, making it one of the most common holiday foods linked to choking incidents. Hiroshi Watanabe, a 72-year-old retired teacher, sat at his dining table with his wife and daughter. The family meal had been carefully prepared for the occasion. Platters of vegetables, fish, and mochi were placed on the table. Hiroshi had eaten mochi countless times in his life, and despite wearing dentures, he still enjoyed the challenge of chewing it in its full form. His wife reminded him to cut it into smaller pieces, but Hiroshi, like many older men of his generation, felt it was fine to eat it whole. The atmosphere was light and relaxed as they talked about the new year. Hiroshi picked up a piece of mochi and began to chew. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, within moments, he coughed sharply and pressed his hand against his throat. His family quickly realized something was wrong. His face started to turn pale, and he was no longer able to speak clearly. His daughter rushed behind him and tried the Heimlich maneuver, a technique she had only seen demonstrated but never performed. She placed her arms around his stomach and pressed upward, but the food did not dislodge. His wife grabbed a towel, trying to clear his mouth, but the mochi had already stuck deep in the back of his throat. Witnesses later said that the sticky rice had sealed against the soft palate, creating a block that was nearly impossible to remove without equipment. The family called emergency services. Within minutes, paramedics arrived and carried their gear into the house. They immediately tried suction equipment, sliding a tube down to remove the mochi, but the rice cake clung stubbornly. One paramedic applied chest compressions while another prepared additional tools. The room filled with urgency as the rescuers worked, but the blockage was still in place. Hiroshi's body weakened during the attempts. His arms slumped at his sides and he eventually went limp in the chair. Medics carried him quickly to the ambulance and rushed him to the nearest hospital. For several more minutes, doctors continued trying to clear the airway and restore his breathing, but the rice cake had caused too much damage and lack of oxygen. Hiroshi was declared dead shortly after arrival. The news of his death spread only within his community. Hiroshi had been a respected teacher for decades, known by many of his former students. At his funeral in Tokyo, relatives, neighbors, and some of his old pupils came to pay their respects. The ceremony was quiet, held following tradition, and his passing was marked by those who remembered his years of service in education. Authorities later included his case in their yearly public reminders about the dangers of mochi during the New Year period. Every January, Japanese media outlets report on choking incidents linked to the rice cakes, most involving elderly men. Warnings are given to cut mochi into smaller pieces, chew carefully, and supervise older family members while eating. Paramedics also emphasize that, even with quick response, mochi can be extremely difficult to remove once lodged in the throat. Hiroshi's death was one among several similar cases that year, reinforcing the risks of a food so deeply tied to tradition. For families across Japan, it served as another reminder that even familiar meals can become unexpectedly dangerous when caution is not taken. It was July 16, 2016, at a county fairground in Austin, Texas. The summer heat pressed down hard on the open field, where hundreds of visitors wandered between food stalls, carnival rides, and livestock pens. In one corner of the fair, a small stage had been set up for contests and performances. That afternoon, the highlight was a chili pepper eating contest. The announcer's voice carried over the speakers, inviting challengers to come forward and test their strength against some of the hottest peppers in the world. Among the volunteers was 28-year-old Mark Rivera, a local construction worker. Mark was known in his circle of friends and co-workers for being competitive and bold, always the one to step up when others hesitated. His crew from a nearby construction site had come to the fair together, and when they saw the contest, they teased him into signing up. He's taken his seat at the long table with several other contestants. Plates of peppers were lined up in front of them, each round increasing in heat. The rules were clear. Each contestant must eat the pepper, swallow it fully, and move on to the next round. The early stages began with jalapenos, then moved up to habaneros. The crowd cheered loudly, many holding up their phones to record. Mark handled the first round easily, though he waved his hands and grabbed water after the habaneros. By the third round, the peppers were much hotter, ghost peppers, than Carolina Reapers, which are known to be among the hottest in the world. Witnesses later said Mark's face grew red and sweat poured down his forehead. He coughed repeatedly, but forced himself to continue, encouraged by his friends shouting his name. At one point, he tried to swallow a big piece but started coughing hard at the same time. In that moment, bits of the pepper and juice went down the wrong way into his airway. Spectators in the front rows noticed right away when Mark dropped the pepper and hunched forward, clutching at his throat. A harsh choking sound came out, followed by quick, strained gasps. His chair rocked as he tried to rise but fell back. The other contestants stood frozen, unsure what to do, while the announcer urgently called for help. Contest staff rushed over and tried back blows, but the pieces of pepper stuck fast, and he was still choking. At first, there were brief, shallow breaths, but within the next minute, his throat began to swell from the irritation, making it harder and harder for air to move, and he slumped sideways onto the stage. Screams erupted from the audience as someone ran toward the first aid tent. Paramedics arrived within moments and went straight to work. Witnesses recalled them tilting his head back, attempting back blows and abdominal thrusts before switching to suction tools and advanced airway equipment. They managed to clear some fragments, but swelling in his throat was already worsening, cutting off the airway almost completely. CPR was started on stage as the crowd was pushed back. After several minutes, he was lifted onto a stretcher and rushed by ambulance to a nearby hospital. Despite continuous resuscitation attempts, doctors could not reverse the airway damage. Within an hour of his collapse, Mark Rivera was pronounced dead. News of the incident spread quickly around the fairgrounds. The contest was immediately canceled, and the area was closed off to visitors. Fair officials released a brief statement expressing shock and promising cooperation with investigators. A week later, Mark's funeral was held in Austin, attended by family, friends, and many of his co-workers from the construction site. His parents spoke briefly, while relatives carried framed photographs of him during the service. Local authorities reviewed the circumstances and noted that while pepper-eating contests were legal, they often lacked proper safety oversight. Following the incident, officials recommended that such events require having medical staff and emergency gear on standby at all times. Several fairs across Texas quietly removed similar contests from their schedules in the following year. It was October 14, 2017, in Manchester, England. The city was lively on a Saturday night, with people filling restaurants, bars, and nightclubs across the busy streets. In the center of town, a newly popular cocktail bar drew a young crowd with flashy drinks and unusual menu items. Among them was a drink prepared with liquid nitrogen, advertised for its smoky, dramatic effect as the vapor rolled across the glass. That night, 23-year-old Emma Davis had gone there to celebrate her birthday with friends. Emma was a university student from Liverpool, studying biology at Manchester University. Classmates had described her as someone who enjoyed group outings and rarely missed a chance to join friends after exams or birthdays. Her small group of classmates reserved a table and ordered several of the bar's signature drinks, including the cocktail that was mixed with liquid nitrogen. The bartender made the special drink right at their table. Witnesses recalled how the glass gave off a heavy white fog as the liquid nitrogen cooled it rapidly. Usually, the nitrogen is supposed to fully evaporate before anyone drinks it, leaving only the alcohol and mixers inside. But on this occasion, the bartender poured the drink and handed it over while vapor was still spilling from the rim. Emma, unaware of the danger, raised it for a quick sip before setting it back down. Almost instantly, something went wrong. Emma dropped the glass, spilling it across the table. She grabbed her stomach tightly and fell against the edge of her chair. Friends at the table panicked and shouted for staff as Emma doubled over, unable to straighten herself. One friend tried to hold her up while others ran toward the bar yelling for help. Bar staff rushed over as Emma slid onto the floor. Witnesses said they heard her groaning while holding her stomach. Her breathing grew shallow, and her face turned pale. Within minutes, her abdomen felt stiff to the touch, a clear sign that something serious had happened inside. likely from the drink she had just taken. Paramedics were called immediately, arriving within 10 minutes. They found Emma unresponsive and in clear distress, and quickly moved her onto a stretcher. Witnesses said they placed an oxygen mask over her face and started checking her vital signs. One paramedic later explained that even swallowing a tiny amount of liquid nitrogen can cause massive damage, as the chemical is stored at nearly 320 degrees Fahrenheit. If ingested, it can instantly perforate the stomach wall and release nitrogen gas inside, expanding with explosive force. By the time Emma was in the ambulance, she had already gone into shock. Medics worked quickly as they rushed her to Manchester Royal Infirmary, but her condition got worse on the way. She went into cardiac arrest just before arrival. Doctors tried to save her, but the internal damage was too severe. Emma Clark was pronounced dead later that night. News of the incident spread quickly through Manchester and across the UK the following day. Local authorities immediately investigated the bar where it happened. Its license was suspended pending a safety review, and inspectors noted that staff had failed to follow guidelines for serving liquid nitrogen in food and drinks. Emma's funeral was held the following week in Liverpool, attended by family members, classmates, and neighbors. Many of her fellow students traveled from Manchester to pay their respects. Photographs of Emma were placed near the front of the service, and several classmates carried flowers to the family's home afterward. In the months that followed, UK authorities reminded restaurants and bars of the strict rules surrounding liquid nitrogen. Officials stressed that it should never be served to customers before fully evaporating, and that staff should be trained in its risks. Several venues across the country voluntarily removed such drinks from their menus. The case became a sobering example of how a novelty meant for entertainment could quickly turn deadly when handled carelessly. It was July 12, 2018, a warm evening in Delhi. The streets were wet from rain earlier in the day, and the air carried a mix of food smells, traffic fumes, and damp ground. People crowded around food stalls near the bus stop. Many office workers stopped to grab something to eat before going home, while buses honked and moved through the traffic. Among them was 36-year-old Rajiv Sharma, an office clerk who had worked late that night. Rajiv often avoided small food carts, but there was one vendor near his bus stop he trusted. He had eaten there before without problems. The man sold fried bread, chickpea curry, and cold sodas kept in glass bottles. On that night, Rajiv ordered a plate of food and asked for a chilled drink to go with it. The vendor worked quickly, serving several customers at once. Besides his cooking setup, he kept a few reused plastic bottles. One held water for mixing drinks, while another, unlabeled, contained a strong cleaning solution he had used earlier to scrub pans. In the rush of serving, he accidentally poured some of the chemical into Rajiv's glass, diluting it with soda. The mistake went unnoticed. Rajiv sat on a small wooden bench by the stall as he ate. After a few bites, he lifted the glass and drank. Almost right away, he started coughing hard and bent forward, spilling some of the liquid onto the ground. People nearby later said he gagged and held his chest. Thick spit mixed with blood showed at his mouth as he struggled to breathe. People around him shouted for help as he dropped the glass. The vendor froze in shock while bystanders rushed to Rajiv's side. One man offered water, but another quickly stopped him, knowing it could make things worse. Rajiv's breathing was fast and shallow. With no ambulance nearby, several men helped him into an auto rickshaw. During the ride, his condition declined quickly. His voice became hoarse, and burns around his mouth and tongue grew darker. Passengers in the rickshaw later recalled hearing him groan softly as his body stiffened, his breath short and irregular. The driver pushed through traffic as fast as he could toward the nearest hospital. Doctors at the emergency ward recognized the signs of caustic ingestion right away. Rajiv's throat and stomach had suffered chemical burns, and his airway was swelling. They attempted to secure his airway with a breathing tube, while giving fluids through an IV line. Nurses prepared emergency equipment, and suction was used to clear his mouth and throat. Despite these efforts, the swelling and internal bleeding were severe. Within half an hour of arrival, Rajiv went into cardiac arrest. Doctors performed CPR and continued resuscitation attempts, but the damage was too extensive. He was pronounced dead that same evening. News of the case spread quickly through the neighborhood. Police visited the food stall, collecting samples of the liquid and questioning the vendor. The container, a reused soda bottle with no label, was found beside the stall's supplies. Authorities later confirmed it contained a concentrated cleaning chemical commonly used to scrub cooking surfaces. Framed photos of him as prayers were recited. Neighbors gathered outside the home, offering support and food to the grieving family. Police opened a case against the vendor, which covers death by negligence. Local health officials also announced new rounds of inspections on food stalls. Public warnings reminded vendors never to keep chemicals in unmarked bottles near cooking areas. In the months that followed, some districts tightened rules requiring vendors to separate cleaning products from food supplies, though enforcement remained inconsistent. For the people who had been at the bus stop that night, the memory of what happened stayed fresh. What had started as an ordinary meal turned into a sudden tragedy, one caused not by spoiled food, but by a preventable mistake. It was November 12, 2015, and the town of Tromsø in northern Norway was already settling into the long winter nights. Snow covered the roofs, and the harbor was dotted with fishing boats tied up for the season. Families stayed indoors to escape the cold, gathering around meals that often included fish caught earlier in the year. Among them was 59-year-old Lars Johansson, a lifelong fisherman. He had spent decades pulling whitefish from the cold Arctic waters and often preserved his catches at home. That year, he had filled several jars with fillets he had canned himself. The jars were kept on a shelf in his cellar, lined up beside potatoes and other stored food. Lars was proud of his home-canned fish and decided to serve it when he hosted a family dinner one evening. Around the table were his wife and adult daughter, both of whom had eaten his preserves many times before. He opened several jars, spooned the fish onto serving dishes, and passed them around with bread and butter. To him, it was a typical meal prepared traditionally. What he did not realize was that the fish had not been heated long enough or at a high enough temperature when he sealed the jars. Home canning requires pressure cooking to kill bacteria, and skipping that step can leave spores alive inside the food. In rare cases, those spores can produce botulinum toxin, one of the most dangerous substances known. For a while, dinner passed without incident. But a few hours later, Lars began to notice that something was wrong. His vision turned blurry, and he rubbed his eyes as though he couldn't focus. His wife noticed his eyelids starting to droop. When he tried to speak, his words came out slow and slurred. At first, the family thought he might be having a stroke. His daughter called emergency services while his condition continued to decline. He complained that his mouth felt dry, and swallowing became more difficult. His breathing grew heavy and he slumped into a chair. Paramedics arrived at the home not long after. They found Lars alert but struggling to keep his eyes open. His speech was weak, and his breathing was shallow. They gave him oxygen and loaded him onto a stretcher for transport. His wife rode along in the ambulance as they headed toward the hospital in Tromsø. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics placed an oxygen mask over his face and used a manual pump to keep air flowing. His chest was barely rising, and they prepared advanced gear in case his airway failed before arrival. At the hospital, doctors quickly recognized the signs of foodborne botulism. They prepared to place a breathing tube and connect him to a ventilator. Antitoxin was requested from the national stockpile, but even with rapid coordination, the process would take time. Within hours of arrival, Lars went into respiratory failure. Doctors attempted to resuscitate him, but the damage from the toxin was already severe. He was pronounced dead less than a day after the family meal. The sudden loss shocked the community. Lars had been known at the harbor for his long years on the water, and neighbors gathered to support his family. His funeral in Tromsø was attended by relatives, fellow fishermen, and friends who shared stories of his work and his time at sea. In the days that followed, Norwegian health officials investigated the case. Samples from the jars confirmed the presence of botulinum toxin. Authorities issued warnings through local media, reminding the public about the dangers of home canning without proper equipment. Leaflets were distributed with instructions on safe methods, especially for fish, which require higher heat and longer processing times than vegetables. Though cases like this are rare, the message was clear. A single mistake in food preservation can have fatal consequences. For those who knew Lars Johansson, the tragedy was a painful reminder that traditional practices must be paired with modern safety standards. It was May 14th, 2017, a warm spring evening in Manhattan. The sidewalks near the subway entrances were crowded with office workers heading home, tourists with shopping bags, and students leaving campus. Food carts lined the street corners, while small delis stayed busy serving people in a rush. Among them was 25-year-old Rachel Stein, a law student on her way back to Brooklyn after a day of classes. Before boarding the subway, she stopped at a deli near the station. She ordered a simple sandwich, something she had done many times before. Rachel had a known sesame allergy and was careful about what she ate. She usually checked with staff or read labels closely, but that evening the roll she was given was mislabeled. It had been baked with sesame flour mixed into the dough, something not visible on the surface. She carried the sandwich down into the subway and boarded a downtown train. The car was crowded, and she sat near the door while unwrapping her food. She took several bites before realizing something was wrong. Her lips started to itch, and swelling appeared around her mouth. Passengers nearby later recalled her rubbing her skin and looking short of breath. Rachel quickly reached into her bag and pulled out her epinephrine injector. For a moment, she hesitated, hoping the symptoms might ease, but the swelling continued. A nurse on the same train urged her to use it right away. She injected the dose into her thigh, and for a short time her breathing seemed to improve. The relief was only temporary. Severe allergic reactions can return even after epinephrine, and many patients require a second dose. Rachel carried only one injector. Within minutes, her voice grew hoarse and her breathing became strained again. She slumped forward, and fellow passengers rushed to help. One pulled the emergency intercom, alerting the conductor. The train was held at the next station, where transit staff had already called for paramedics. By the time the doors opened, Rachel had collapsed onto the floor of the subway train. The nurse kept her airway clear while passengers tried to comfort her. Paramedics arrived quickly, placed her on a stretcher, and gave her a second dose of epinephrine along with oxygen. They carried her out of the station and into a waiting ambulance. Inside the ambulance, Rachel's condition worsened. Paramedics worked to keep her breathing with a bag and mask, though swelling in her airway made it difficult. They began IV fluids and got advanced gear ready. Before they reached the hospital doors, she went into cardiac arrest. At the emergency department, doctors immediately began resuscitation efforts. A breathing tube was placed, chest compressions were started, and additional medications were given. Despite continued attempts, her airway swelling and oxygen loss had caused severe damage. After multiple rounds of treatment, she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Her funeral took place in Brooklyn later that week. Family, friends, and classmates gathered to remember her. Photos of her graduation plans and law school life were displayed as relatives recited prayers. Investigators confirmed that the bread had been mislabeled at the bakery before being sold to the deli. At the time, sesame was not part of the list of allergens required by U.S. labeling laws. The case became one of several examples later raised in public debates about food safety. In 2023, sesame was officially added to the list of major allergens that must be clearly labeled on all packaged foods. For those who had been on the subway that evening, the event remained a stark reminder of how quickly a simple meal could turn into a medical emergency.